podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the third Sunday after Pentecost for the week of June 9th, 2024, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I am excited that we had some nice discussion about what we talked about last week, and especially when you are able to phrase some of these questions, I think it does allow, at least even for me, a little bit of time to be able to process these, and it's really fun to kind of hear the reactions and correspondence back and forth. So the last week's question we had was, how can we be better stewards of the environment even when it's difficult? And one of the questions that kind of kept recircling around in different discussions was the need and desire for things being renewable. Thinking about in the aspect of, if you look back even 50, 75 years ago, we had a lot of glass bottles for things and how there was deposits and different things to be able to try to get those back. And I know a little ways back, we talked a little bit about that. And I think it gets back to, and was kind of the summation of one of the references I was talking about at that point was talking about putting pressure a little bit on these companies to hold them responsible for some of this stuff, not just purely the consumer. And that we've kind of had this separation of, you are creating a product and putting it in something non-renewable and then expecting the consumer to purely do all the work. And I think there is an aspect of going back to the older model of where the producer had investment as well, that they were willing to have some type of deposit to get the things back to make sure that they had more of a circular economy. And I think there is an aspect to that. I will also attach a link down in the show notes down below talking about, there was an interesting article discussion from Marketplace this last week talking about how as we are potentially shifting from fossil fuels, that we have a lot of changing of economy. For instance, Iowa, a lot of the economy is based off of corn, and corn is being used in a lot of ethanol products. And if we are losing the desire and need for gasoline and fuel for vehicles, the desire and need for corn drops dramatically. And this person's then response was, hopefully then we can get some of these animals out into the fields, especially that pigs in Iowa outnumber the number of citizens in the United States in and of themselves, and there isn't real mitigation plans on treating sewage coming from pigs. Meanwhile, they defecate 3 times as much as people do. So there's some issues there, and the potential to be able to have some better results long term. But is this also difficult? Yes, because it's the aspect of totally turning over an economy and what we've been known for and thought about for decades. And I think this is part of the unique spot in which we're in. And especially as we get into some of the text this week, I think we at times lose that within the gospel. We forget at times how radical Jesus really was in the time and place that Jesus was. We know the story. We understand it conceptually, and we've been so far removed from it. It's, yes, of course we'd be doing it this way. And we forget how at times Jesus was quite radical in what Jesus was stating. And in understanding that, grasping that, holding that, living with that, we understand that then there's times within the faith that we need to be able to stand up and do radical things that seem outrageous, but yet they're very needed within our society. So let's just jump into it. We have alternative readings here. So one of the possible Old Testament texts you can have this week is from 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 to 11, optionally 12 through 15, 16 through 20, and optionally chapter 11, verses 14 and 15. What is this whole thing? We then jump. So the same Samuel that we heard God calling last week is now an elder, and he has gotten quite old. And the people then and the elders are kind of like, Samuel, you've been great, but we really want a king. This is what every other nation around us has, and we really think that would be a great idea. Samuel is trying to kind of warn them, is this really what you want to do? We've kind of understand that the desires of a single human can definitely get persuaded and pulled and can really be difficult. And you look at a lot of these different neighboring nations, they've had issues, and the people are like, no, this is what we want. We really want a king. And God then states to Samuel, let it be. They'll learn, basically. We'll give them this, even though this is not what's going to be best for them. And what we get then in chapter 11 is the coronation of King Saul. And as we kind of know, Saul starts out great, and then Saul kind of turns sour. But it's the aspect of how, even though sometimes God does know best, we still have our own desires that sometimes cause us to falter and causes us to mess up a little bit. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 138, all 8 verses of it. And this is recognizing that we're singing praise and recognizing that we are this holy temple. We are the ones that need to be giving voice and movement to who God is. And in doing that, we should be these representations of who God is out in the world and recognizing all the different aspects of what God is doing, bringing up the lowly, cooling down the haughty, making sure that we are the epitome of God on earth for other people, and thus we are a walking and living sacrifice and praise to God. The other alternative Old Testament text I think is really fun, coming out of Genesis chapter 3, verses 8 through 15. This is where we have the first sin. This is where we have the fall, if you want to put it that way. This is where God is walking in the garden, which I think is amazing to think about, that we are so in touch with God that we understand God just walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. And God is wondering where we're at. Adam responds that he's hiding because he's naked. Who told you you were naked? The woman gave me this thing to eat, and so I ate it. So he's blaming it on the woman. The woman then blames it on the serpent. The serpent then has to crawl on its stomach the rest of its life. And then it's also that there will be hardships coming from this based on the fact that we disobeyed God and eating from the tree that we were told not to eat from. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 130, all 8 verses of that as well. And what do we get out of this? And this is a little bit more of almost lament coming from this one, where you have the crying out to God and hearing my voice and recognizing that we need forgiveness, recognizing that we fall short, recognizing that God is in all this and God loves us and will redeem us, but recognizing that we continue to fall short. The epistle text or second reading this week is from 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verses 13 to chapter 5 verse 1. And this is a message of reaching out to the people of Corinth and realizing that we are speaking this spirit of faithfulness and truth about who Christ is, who Jesus was, and recognizing that there is an aspect of God that still has to come in and the Holy Spirit working within them. And so thus we don't have to lose heart when it's difficult. We recognize that there is an aspect of this that is beyond our control, recognizing that there are things that sometimes we cannot see and it makes it hard for us to grapple with, but we also have to realize that the stuff we can't see is also the eternal stuff. And the realm of heaven around us that sometimes is hard to see, but recognizing that we are still working and interacting with it even when we can't see it. It's this part of faith that sometimes is difficult to grapple with, that we are working within this construct of we are working with people and helping people even though that we can't necessarily fully understand and see what is all going on at the same time. But yet realizing that God is also working on things behind the scenes that we can't see. And in doing that, we have to keep heart and recognize and believe and trust that God is doing God's thing, even when we're not seeing it. The gospel text this week is out of Mark chapter 3, verses 20 to 35. This is early on in Jesus' ministry. And we have moments here where Jesus has started doing different miracles. And you have scribes who are questioning his authority, questioning if this is Satan, speaking out and doing these different things, people wondering who this is. And Jesus kind of casts it all aside of, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, the kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, a house will not be able to stand. If Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but his end has come. This recognition then of how Christ is coming in to conquer this divide and bring us back together, and recognizing that we are one body of Christ. And we get then at the end of this section where people in the crowd stating his mother and brothers and sisters are outside waiting for him. And Jesus kind of responds with, who is my mother and brothers? These people around me are my mothers and brothers. And this is this representation of, I'm not having these stumbling blocks in the way. It's that I'm working with the people around me to bring and unite people instead of you're in, you're not idea. And I think that's where at times we as a body, and especially in a world in which we're in, need to remember that we are all part of one body of Christ, all coming together and becoming something that's much greater than the sum of its individual parts. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug. Boar, Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between the Sermon Brainwaves podcasts or commentaries or discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, directions, and different commentaries even, just to look at and think about with these texts. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, along with art, hymns, liturgical colors, even daily devotions, which are super, super helpful. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This either comes out as a weekly or a monthly newsletter reflection that goes through these texts similar to like I do with different ecological perspectives, or the monthly newsletter will have all those along with a lot of different other resources of what's going on in the upper Midwest region. So even if you're outside of that, check out and see what else is all going on in the world. It's a really unique place. And if you're enjoying listening to me talk for a half an hour each week, you'll really enjoy checking these things out. Those will be down in the show notes. We as humans struggle with the idea of what do we actually need? And that's hard. What do we actually need as individuals? What do we need within our faith life? What do we need to be able to survive? What is God calling us into? We struggle with this. And we can see this in the 1 Samuel text where there's this desire, and having read through the stuff, we know where this leads, and it leads to hardships because of our stubbornness to not listen to what God is saying and say, this prophet model has actually been working really well. You're just wanting somebody to be able to cast blame on. You're wanting that individual leader, and you're going to be frustrated because they're human, and I created humans, and I understand the shortcomings of humans. We also see that in the Genesis text where God makes this beautiful place, and yet we still find the one thing we are told not to do. That's where we end up going and doing that one thing, and it causes separation. It causes us a divide. It causes us to not be able to live fully into this truth. We get frustrated when then we have these things that we have been told to do that we shouldn't do, and then we do it, and then we get frustrated when then, okay, we're trying to undo this, or in this case, we're trying to be able to spread this things, and it's not moving as fast as we want. The outer world is changing rapidly, and it's not happening the way that we thought it would be. Well, we can look into Jesus' ministry, and we can see that even within Jesus' ministry. And I think that's where like the 2 Corinthians text, even moving into Mark, really is helpful. And recognizing that we have a very forgiving God. We have one who recognizes our shortcomings as long as we are able to recognize it within ourselves and talk to God about it. But recognizing that we fall short. And in doing that, it sometimes causes our judgment to falter. And that is difficult for us to recognize. And I think there's actually been one within the last year that has been super helpful in this, because it recognizes within our human existence, there's sometimes we forget. There is times that we overlook. There is times we just completely miss what has all happened, and forces us to potentially reevaluate different things. And so this week we're going to talk about the wild boar paradox. And the wild boar paradox is quite simple. After Chernobyl happened in the mid-80s and we had nuclear fallout, there were 3 different dangerous isotopes that were released at Chernobyl: iodine-131, strontium-90, and cesium-137. Now, when you're dealing with a lot of these, you have half-lives. And so strontium and cesium have half-lives of 29 and 30 years respectively, where iodine has a half-life of 8 days. So it isn't really that long-lasting. But what we're talking about here is when you have a radioactive material, it then can be unstable for a moment and then stabilize, or it can hold that state for an extended period of time. And through calculations, we have figured out what the half-life is. So thus, it's reducing its radioactivity, and we want to get these down to much lower levels. There's a lot of actually technically low-level radiation that is around us all the time. But it's this aspect of getting it down to more of that normal level compared to these elevated levels. And that's part of the problem of Chernobyl. And what we've been doing then over the last 40 years is being able to start monitoring, and we've noticed within animal species, all of them, it's been following the decay. We're at the point where we should be seeing these half-lives, and we're seeing it in every species except one, the wild boar. And it really has been stumping scientists for an extended period of time, because this then kind of disrupts how we understand physics. It disrupts how we understand how all this stuff works within nuclear reactions and how long this stuff lasts. And to have this like staggering thing that we're taking all these blood samples and meat samples, and we're realizing that these boars individually, the only species that seem to have these elevated levels compared to everything else. And so what does this all mean? Well, we have to then understand when we have some type of nuclear fallout like this, what all happens. Yes, they have the half-lives, but it also means it needs to get into the ecosystem in and of itself. So that means landing on the ground and slowly sinking into the ground as water moves through. And that's the key thing. Water moves through, and at a period of time, it eventually gets down into like the water table. And what is tapping into that water table? Mushrooms and detritivores, things that are breaking things down, and is being able to bring that up. What do wild boars eat? Wild boars eat mushrooms, truffles, these detritivores, these things that are sucking up and eating the things that are deteriorating away, but also it's tapping into that water. What they started to realize is that we had to go back further in history, is that in the 1960s, the Soviets had done some nuclear weapon testing, which then again had over an extended period of time had small pockets of radiation that hit the ground, and it slowly then got into the water table over a period of time, and it was hitting that, and that's what then was being sucked up and brought into these mushrooms, which then meant the boars were eating them. Thus, they had these elevated levels, and arguably, the meat of these wild boars were just starting to get into some of the Chernobyl stuff because it had been going through the Soviet nuclear weapon stuff, and that it really hasn't started or just starting the Chernobyl half-life, and it's going to take an extended period of time for us then to be able to see the wild boars' levels of radiation drop down. This is a moment for us to recognize the long-lasting effects of what nuclear weapons do and how long the ramifications of decisions that we have can last. And really, when we look at Scripture, this should be a no-duh reminder, but it's one of these things as humans that we really wrestle with. We can look at the 1 Samuel text, knowing what happens and recognizing that we had this desire for a king, and this is yet again, it's going to take many generations for the people to realize this isn't really the best idea. Even though there was some good kings in there like King David, and Solomon was arguably okay, and Saul at different points was okay initially. We look at even the Genesis text and we started really good, but then our own desires sometimes trump what God is stating. And here we are again, where Jesus is recognizing and trying to help people understand, I'm here to bring people together, not be figuring out ways to accuse, figuring out ways to separate, figuring out who's in, who's out. No, I'm here to be this uniting force. Even when it's hard, like the 2 Corinthians text, that we have to keep heart, that we're trying to work together on something. And I think that's what this all comes back to. The wild boar paradox is the idea that all of us need to recognize the decisions and things that we are making have long-term ramifications that affect all of us. When we look at a lot of different climate things we won't dig into this week, but that's a lot of what we are talking about is we have made decisions as a lot of, let's be honest, first world nations that are affecting everybody. And that means we need to make adjustments to help for the betterment of everybody, even if it means for ourselves that we need to humble ourselves. Because it's very easy, like knowing what happens with King Saul or knowing what happens here in Genesis, that it's so easy for us to say, well, so-and-so told me to do it, so I did it. Or I am greater. I deserve these different things. And I think there's a lot of times where we need to be able to take a humble pill and recognize there is a lot of things, especially me being in a first world nation, recognizing there's things that we can do better. And that might mean that I make major adjustments to my life to be able to help elevate others that I may never meet because of sacrifices that I'm doing. And that's hard for my brain to wrap its head around, but it's also for the betterment of everybody. And that's kind of what we're getting into here in the 2 Corinthians text. There is times that we need to be able to look beyond ourselves and recognize that the process and the change and the evolution of this is going to take extended periods of time, which seem heartbreakingly slow, but it's also important. One of the things that my wife and I are looking at doing is putting in a native garden. And when we are doing that, there's plants that we have, and some of them are not very big. But we're talking with the nursery and talking with people and recognizing they will grow. It will take time. So give them the space so that they can actually grow. And I am mentally preparing myself if I'm going to be preparing this bed. It's not going to necessarily look pretty for a few years, but it's going to, over time, bear these beautiful flowers and bear things to be able to allow the different native insects and bees and stuff to be able to be around it in our yard. And that's what we're wanting. We're wanting this to be a place for them to be able to want to be. But realizing that type of culture takes time. It doesn't just happen overnight. It doesn't just happen when I plant those things into the ground. It's going to take time. These are things as humans that we really struggle with, is the sense of time. Recognizing that there's things that we need to learn and an evolutionary process or a time and process for these things to develop out as we need them to grow and change, and as we as humans grow and change and sometimes reverse phase from different things in which we have done and the ways that we've always done them. And this is what's frustrating, and this is what also as Christians we are called into. We are called into at times looking at situations and being like, man, this is going to be uncomfortable. It's going against the grain, but it's going to take some time for this to get right. And that doesn't necessarily mean pushing something, but it means also being able to and willing to vocalize things. And there's that hard balance too of loving people and also at times taking a hard stand. Jesus at this moment kind of takes a hard stand against the traditional family culture, trying to help them recognize, I am not just here for people who I am close with. I am here for people beyond me. And that's a hard pill for us sometimes to swallow. It's a hard pill for us to swallow, that decisions that other people made, even for me, well outside my lifetime, is affecting a whole area of the globe. And it's going to affect it for decades still to come. But it's also a good teaching tool for us to remember and for us to be wise. It's easy for us to say, let's do something that's going to take care of the problem right here, right now. But did we think about the long-term ramifications of those decisions? And that's the difficult part sometimes of faith, is being able to think about and consider others that we may never meet well outside of the scope of what we typically do. So the question I have for you this week is, what changes can you make for the betterment of everybody long term? What changes can you make that are difficult to you that can be for the long-term betterment of everybody? Because I think that's when we think through that stuff and contemplate that stuff, it forces us to get in the habit of thinking of long-term ramifications. It forces us to consistently then be going through that and processing that. And how do we as people continue to think about the long horizon, even if we're not going to be part of the long horizon? And as people of faith, that is part of what we are called into. To continue to pass on the faith means that we need to continue to think beyond ourselves, beyond our generation, beyond our descendants' generation, thinking way out into the future, laying foundations that will last compared to things that are flashes in the pan. This is not our normal MO, and as we can see in multiple different texts this week, we can see our natural quick reaction time is much easier compared to long-term builds. But I would also argue that long-term builds are much more rewarding. I know for me, there is so much more that I would love to do with this podcast, and I've talked about different aspects if you go into like special episodes and stuff. But I also realize the long-term foundation, as I've been doing this now for scarily like 6.5 years, the long-term foundation is allowing, and I can see benefits that are coming from it. And I may not be able to react on it today, but it's going to allow for things in the future that are beyond what I can already imagine. Because there's already things that, yes, it's taken a long time to get to this point in the scheme of life, but I'm also starting to see some of the different benefits that came from it that I couldn't have imagined when I first started. That is building for long term. That is recognizing that just like we are finding with Chernobyl, that there was different things that affected things much in different ways than we ever expected, it can happen the other way too. That we start doing things where we're thinking it's going to only do this long term for us, and we find that no, it also is doing this, and this is way better than we ever would have expected. That is what we are talking about here, and that is what I think Jesus is trying to get our heads into that mindset of. When we start thinking long, when we start thinking beyond ourselves, blessings start coming that flow much more than we ever would have expected. Are we going to mess that up? Sure. We can see that in the Psalms where there's times where we mess up, and that unfortunately is part of our human condition. But we also can see benefits that go long beyond our generation as well. As long as we continue to turn to God with it and continue to make difficult decisions and sometimes make difficult changes within our own lives to be able to move in directions where God is calling us to be. As a church and as a world, we're at the point where we need to make these difficult decisions. It's hard, but yet we also don't realize potentially the blessings that we're missing out on. And the longer that we wait, the longer we put some of these things off, the longer we also are potentially doing long-term damage that we don't even know that we're doing yet. Just like what the Boar Paradox is teaching us now. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.